Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 249 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas. These areas are sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, such as employees and contractors. I am pleased to announce that I am now the compliance ambassador for the Red Flag Group. This will give me an opportunity to further my goal to be the compliance evangelist. So I hope you'll check out the Red Flag Group at www.redflaggroup.com. In this episode, I visit with Adam Turteltaub from the SCCE about our joint reflections and observations from our recent trip to Cuba. We were not on the same trip. We happen to be staying at the same hotel. The episode comes in at just over under 23 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening.
Adam and I happen to be at the same hotel at the same time in Havana, Cuba, about 10 days ago. So I thought this would give us, certainly me, a great excuse to have the first FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report travelogue issue. So Adam, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, welcome.
Thank you. Good to hear your voice, and it was a great surprise seeing you in Cuba. I traveled a lot of places, and this definitely beats running into someone I know who was standing in line at the McDonald's at the Tokyo airport for strange encounters while traveling.
Well, I was standing in an elevator later in the evening, and I saw this very tall guy walk by, and the top of his head kind of shined, but the back was thick and curly, and I said, there's only one person on earth I know that looks like that. So I got to go see this Adam, and sure enough it was.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that's a good thing, but anyway.
So what we wanted to do here is sort of share our impressions and experiences of the trip. We have both blogged about this. I wrote about the FCPA angle on doing business in Cuba, and Adam's written some of his thoughts on where we might be going as a country and perhaps business-wise. So with that starting point, Adam, what were 2 to 3 of the top things that struck you or impressed you about Cuba?
Well, aside from a lot of the socio-political things and the ubiquity of classic cars from the 1950s and classic architecture from that area, I think from all of our perspective, from a compliance and ethics management issue is one, as I said in my blog post, it's not a question of whether American companies will be going there. It's a question of when. It's clear which way the momentum is right now, and it's definitely towards greater relations with Cuba. I think, secondly, this is an economy unlike anything that most American companies have dealt with before. I mean, you've got people who, as I recall, the salary ranges from $17 to $37 a month, and everyone works for the government virtually in the entire country. That's not something that most businesses are used to. And I think, third, there's a lot of desire for investment to come in, but business, I think, really needs to be prepared for operating in a very different environment, and one where, truthfully, the economy is in really bad shape. That, as you walk through the streets of Havana, for example, you see beautiful building after beautiful old colonial building, but a significant number of them are hollow on the inside from just decay and collapse.
That was one of the things that struck me as well. It seemed almost surreal that I was either on a movie set from the 1950s or I was in a country that had not done any infrastructure repair since 1960. And unfortunately, the latter may be the case. Our tour guide was explaining that people live in apartments till the roof collapses. Then they move to another apartment. It's just there's been almost no infrastructure spending. On the business side, I guess, Adam, I would agree certainly with all your points, and I would add the following, that in the talks we had with representatives of both the Cuban government and other individuals about business investment was that the driving force of business in Cuba is not simply economics. So obviously I'm from Texas, so when you explain something that along the lines of, you're going to make a lot of money doing this, that tends to persuade people to do things. And that is not really the guiding light, I think, for the Cuban government. They have a very large social component of what they want to do with doing business in Cuba. That includes bringing hard currency in because they desperately need money. But it may be things like building roads, building schools, helping them improve their agriculture, which their production is so low they can't feed their own 11.2 million population. They have to import food. So some of the things that might persuade a U.S. company to go in may not be persuasive to the Cuban government, and you need to understand that to tailor your message. And it leads to the larger point that I think you started with. It's going to be very different for U.S. companies doing business in Cuba.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I was very fortunate to be able to do this trip. And for anyone listening, I mean, it's notable that despite the easing of restrictions, you still, just as an American, really can't just buy a ticket and just go. The way to go is still with groups organized by institutions. I went on a UCLA-related trip. Tom, yours was what, the Texas State Bar, I think?
Right.
Had arranged it. And so you get a very planned itinerary, though you are free to wander the streets if you'd like to. It's not like you're herded like cattle from pen to pen. But what's interesting seeing all of this is, in many ways, it reminded me of when I was fortunate enough to go to China in 1979 before the investment poured in there, and that you're dealing with a place where, to your point, a lot of infrastructure hasn't been developed, and frankly, up until now, there hasn't been the need for tons. I mean, our trip went beyond Havana to a town called Cienfuegos, which is about 4 hours away, and there was 2 or 3 lanes of highway in each direction and a car probably every quarter of a mile. And from there, we went to this town called Trinidad, which up until the 60s, there was no road into it. You only got in by hiking over the mountains or by sea, and that was best described as a 1.5-lane road. So there's a lot yet to be done in terms of that. And to your point about agriculture, we were told 80% of the agriculture is imported, and there's a need for that. Now, honestly, a lot of it, I think, has to do with communists, buying, seizing estates and redistributing the land. Part of it obviously has to do with the soil. There's large parts that we went through where the soil was very rocky and clearly not arable. But yes, I mean, people do need that. The one thing I think that, though, is significant is, and I think companies have to be aware of, is the salaries that people are paid is not enough. And Cubans have gotten into the habit of trying to find other ways to supplement their income, legally or not. We were told that slippage is a big problem. A bunch of rebar gets delivered to a job site, and a lot of it disappears quickly because people just take it to resell to supplement their income. Likewise, there's plenty of people who do things lawfully. So, for example, a teacher may tutor on the outside for people. So you've got people who are used to finding other ways to make money. The thing that might be a challenge is a lot of them have been doing it for years in a way that's a black market method and may not be prepared for a Western-style company where if they deliver 2 tons of rebar, it's because they expect 2 tons of rebar will go into the construction, not that a certain portion of it will naturally just disappear.
Right. So the other thing, though, is that one of the questions that I've been mulling over is what kind of company or what type of U.S. business, rather, would find a market in Cuba. So I think we both observed there is a high level of poverty. It seemed to be uniform poverty. This is not poverty of people dying in the streets, but people don't seem to have much, if any, extra money. And so the consumables or consumer goods that typically Americans would buy or sell overseas may be out of the reach of the normal Cuban. Yeah. I think smartphones or cell phones are going to be very popular, so I can certainly see that. I can certainly see agricultural companies going in, and I think there was a tractor company that's gotten a license to do business there to help increase that. Tourism is going to be big, but that's going to be for people like us, not the Cuban people, unless they're involved in the tourist industry. So I would ask any U.S. company to think through that question of really why are you going down there? What's your strategy? If it's short-term profit, I think that's doomed to failure. The experiences of many U.S. companies in China may be a guideline, but the Cuban economy is different enough that it really may be different again.
Yeah, and I agree with you on a lot of levels and a lot of points. I mean, I think one of the more humorous conversations we had about how few assets most Cuban households had is that the guy explained that a divorce costs 2 cooks, which is the equivalent to $2. And as he pointed out, Cubans don't have very much, so a divorce settlement is not difficult to reach. There's just not that much to divide up. And for everywhere you went, I mean, you don't see, like you said, you don't see people starving in the streets by any means at all. People do seem as if their basic human needs are being met. But beyond that, you know, short of remittances and gifts from relatives abroad, there's not much money for most people to be able to access luxury goods or even things that would be perceived as a luxury there, but to us seem, you know, quite normal. You know, I know we bought a bunch of baseball caps, a few extras, and the kids just couldn't believe they could get a baseball hat. But at the same time, I think, yeah, China's a good indicator of it. A lot of American companies got burned because they saw a market of 1 billion people and thought they would sell a lot, and it just, you know, and it took a while for the development to get there. You know, China first became a manufacturing hub. In terms of Cuba, I think you're spot on about phones. I think one of the more notable things was, you know, seeing how many people already have cell phones, the line in front of cell phone stores, and then since at this point the phones, it's kind of funny, there's all these people with smartphones, but the cell phone system doesn't actually provide data, so they're all standing in front of Wi-Fi hotspots looking at their getting to the data that way. There's opportunities. I think pharmaceutical companies would likely have a market there, though again that's going to go through the government because healthcare there is state-owned. You know, I would imagine that there would be some market, though again it's not going to be individuals, it's all going to be government institutions for motor vehicles of various types. You know, there's still a need for trucks and less passenger cars, I would imagine, than things like trucks. I mean, as cool as it is seeing all those old 50s cars running around, it's sort of shocking when you see goods being brought to market in what's obviously a 1940s or 50s truck still. Tractors you mentioned, it's not going to be, you know, luxury items or even things like, you know, fancy ice cream bars, other than for really the tourist economy or for a very occasional treat for a Cuban. However, things could change quickly. I mean, you know, the reality is at this point, the only people involved in the private sector there are people who have paladars, you know, which are these restaurants in people's homes and people running guest houses, and to an extent artists who are able to sell internationally. I mean, it's people really have to be prepared for the fact that there really is no private sector to speak of at this point.
And so, Adam, you know, I wrote my blog post last week, and I focused on the FCPA aspects of this. And I talked about it from the U.S. company perspective and what the U.S. company would need to do business in Cuba. But I've been thinking about what does the Cuban government need to do and what do Cuban citizens need to do to prepare to be contractual counterparties to U.S. companies, whether that is in the form of a facilitation agent, a sales agent, or a direct contracting party. So might you have any thoughts on where the Cuban people might need to go to be able to sign contracts where U.S. companies have to have FCPA language?
Yeah. So some of that's a little obviously beyond my depth. I'm unlike you, I'm missing the law degree. But, you know, I think one of the things they're going to have to do is start understanding the way business is done in the West. You know, the knowledge of the FCPA obviously isn't there yet because they haven't really played in the global market. I mean, on the good side is Cuba, and I think you noted this in your blog post, scores relatively cleanly in things like the Transparency International Global Perceptions Index for Latin America. It does well for Latin American countries, but I don't think people are used to the third-party type reviews that what we're working with now with Red Flag, the companies like them are doing on behalf of their customers. And I think there's a lot of things that they're going to need to better understand that, the government and business are not the same outside of Cuba as they are in Cuba. And I think there's things like stuff that I don't think people think about and for which there's big differences, like what are the limits of data privacy? What can you share? What can't you share? I don't know what the ethos is on sexual harassment. I mean, we see differences between countries already around the world and the developed economies. I don't know what those kinds of, what the mores are there, and what people consider proper and improper behavior in the workplace. And I think the idea that employment isn't perennial is going to be a different concept for people. I mean, they're going to be going from a planned economy where jobs are largely scripted to one where rules change and companies contract and expand over time, and that there's no security for people as compared to what they're used to. And so a lot of it, I think, is going to take education, which in some ways is very difficult to get because the Internet, well, one, it's hard to access there, but secondly, I'm not sure it's screened for most Cubans. I have to admit I was completely offline for the week. But secondly, as U.S. and other Western businesses start doing there, you have to be prepared that you're going to have to educate people in a lot of what we would consider basics that everyone should know, because that's not the kind of economy they've been working with.
Right. So we met with some lawyers from law firms, for instance, and there are 3 law firms in Cuba, Cuban law firms that are authorized to represent foreign clients. But those law firms are all owned by the government, and those lawyers are all government employees. So as a lawyer, if you practice in the United States, it doesn't matter what state you were in, your first and only duty is to your client. That might be different in the Cuban system. Certainly the lawyer-client privilege could be different in the Cuban system. Even if you have a contractual right to sue for breach of contract, if that suit is against the Cuban government, 1, they may have sovereign immunity, but 2, if they don't, you may never be able to enforce that judgment if you get it. So there's a whole host of legal issues. But one of the things I was really thinking about is how do we in the U.S. compliance community train the Cubans on what to expect? So one of the things when you hire a third party is you want to make sure they've been trained under the FCPA. So how do we get training to those people? How do we communicate to them, these are the rules that a U.S. company has to live by, and now you're going to have to live by them, so that a U.S. company can document all of their interactions with you, because you, my lawyer in Cuba, are actually a foreign government official under the FCPA. At this point, I don't pretend to have any of the answers to those questions, but I think they're questions that need to be posed and debated going forward, and I hope the compliance community will have a role in shaping some of the answers.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, there is one thing that works, I think, to advantage is I think the answer for a lot of these issues is going to be training. And the good thing when it comes to that is Cuba has a good educational system. I mean, children go to elementary school, high school. I can't remember how many years you're required to attend for, and there are a large number of university graduates there. I mean, the problem for Cuba at this point is that those people aren't necessarily finding the opportunities they want, which is leading to a brain drain there. But the creation of new opportunities that could come from U.S. and other foreign investment may help that. But you do have a workforce that has education and is used to learning. And I think it's going to take a lot of patience because, again, you're starting from a lot of different sets of assumptions out there, and it will take a while and a lot of vigilance and care to ensure that things are getting followed up on, and convincing people that you're really serious about this, that this isn't something you're saying just to say. but that it's something that you're saying out of a sincere commitment. And the way business works is not the way it's portrayed in the movies or you've been told. It's the way that my business operates, whether it's a big multinational or a small private company that's suddenly investing there.
Adam, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. Do you have maybe any closing thoughts or impressions or things that you really struck you on your visit, or anything else that you might want to share with us?
The closing thing I would say to everyone, honestly, and I think you'll agree with me, is go. I mean, it is an extraordinary place. I travel a lot for this job. I travel a lot in my personal life, and I've, as I said, I went to China in 1979. So far this year for SCCE, I've been in Dubai and Prague and Madrid, and it was an extraordinary experience. There is very little I've seen in the world that is like it. And I think right now is a unique moment in time between sort of the end of sort of the classical U.S.-Cuban relations and what's going to come next, whatever that may be. And I think it's a good time to go to get a sense of really what things are like before the floodgates come and everything changes. I mean, already they're expecting 200,000 Americans to visit this year. But what it's going to be like 5 or 10 years from now is going to be very different. And somebody walking in after change is afoot may not realize how much things are changing and how quickly they're likely to be changing there. So I think it's good to sort of get the before picture so you understand really how far things have come and also what the expectations were before all these changes happened.
To that I would only say, to quote my good friend Tweedledum, ditto, ditto. Absolutely go and go within the next 12 months if you can. I guess the other thing that struck me, in addition to the kind of surrealness because of our lack of really any new construction for so long, was I had not fully appreciated the Spanish colonial presence, and I had forgotten that Havana was the head of Spain's Caribbean empire. So there were quite a large amount of colonial buildings, and they worked somewhat to restore those buildings. So I was very impressed by the colonial architecture, and frankly, I would have thought that a communist regime would have taken those down first because of the oppressive, the way that's viewed in communist ideology. But they've restored those and kept those as part of their heritage. So I felt really privileged to be able to see some very old sort of 1600s architecture that I had not seen in places in the Caribbean before. So, but I would just echo, if you have the chance in the next 12 months, go. It's going to change. Change is coming, as you said in your blog post. It's inevitable. There's going to be a political solution at some point, even with our dysfunctional government, and the floodgates will open.
Absolutely. And pretty soon nobody will care what we have to say because it'll change so much.
Well, Adam, as always, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to our next visit.
Thank you. Pleasure for me, too.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have one call to action for you, and I have one deliverable for you. My call to action is if you would rate this podcast on iTunes, if you're listening on iTunes. And my deliverable is I put together a white paper on doing business in Cuba under the FCPA. I'm happy to share that with you if you will shoot me an email and tell me that you listen to this podcast all the way through. If you have any questions, of course, you can always contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, that's the same email address to request my white paper on doing business with Cuba under the FCPA. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.